As Mike and Elder Chidi finished their talk, the young man stood up, his mind heavy with thoughts. He thanked the elder and began his journey home, the cool evening breeze rustling through the trees. When Mike arrived at his house, he could sense the anticipation in the air. His parents, Mama Ada and Mr. James, were waiting eagerly in the living room. As soon as they heard the door open, Mama Ada called out, "Mike, is that you?" "Yes, Mama," Mike replied, his voice tired but calm. He made his way to the living room, guided by the familiar layout of his home, and settled into a wooden chair. He could hear his parents shifting in their seats, their curiosity almost palpable. Mama Ada couldn't contain herself any longer, so she asked, her voice filled with hope and worry, "Tell us what happened. What did Elder Chidi say? And more importantly, what have you decided?" Mike took a deep breath, collecting his thoughts before speaking. "Elder Chidi and I had a long talk," he began. "He listened to everything I had to say about how hurt and betrayed I felt." Mr. James leaned forward, his voice gentle. "And how do you feel now, son?" Mike paused for a moment. "I'm still hurt, Papa, but Elder Chidi made me see things from a different perspective. He reminded me of the challenges I've faced and overcome in my life." Mama Ada reached out and squeezed Mike's hand. "What else did he say, my dear?" "He asked me to consider giving Kiki a chance to explain herself," Mike continued. "He believes there might be more to the story than we know." Mr. James nodded approvingly. "And what did you decide?" Mike's voice grew softer. I told Elder Chidi that I would try to see Kiki and listen to her explanation. I can't promise forgiveness right away, but I'm willing to hear her out." A smile spread across Mr. James's face. "That's good, my son. That's very good. It's the first step towards forgiveness." Mama Ada couldn't hold back her tears of relief. "Oh, Mike," she said, her voice choked with emotion. "I'm so proud of you. It takes great strength to be willing to listen after being hurt." Mike nodded, a small smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "It won't be easy, Mama. But Elder Chidi made me realize that I love Kiki for who she is, not for her appearance. Her scar doesn't change that." Mr. James stood up and placed a hand on Mike's shoulder. "You're showing great wisdom, son. Remember, true love isn't about perfection. It's about acceptance and understanding." "Your father's right," Mama Ada added. "And who knows? Maybe once you hear Kiki's side of the story, things will become clearer." Mike took another deep breath. "I hope so, Mama. I really do." The family sat in comfortable silence for a moment. Mr. James couldn't help but be proud of his son. As the sun rose on a new day, Mr. Akin prepared himself for a challenging journey. He had promised to visit the Agbio community to speak with Mike's parents, hoping to find a way to mend the rift between their children. As he set out from his home, a mixture of determination and apprehension filled his heart. Walking through the streets of his Yoruba village, Mr. Akin couldn't help but ponder the wisdom of his decision. "I hope this isn't a bad idea," he muttered to himself, "considering the tension between our communities. But for Kiki's happiness, I'll do whatever it takes." As Mr. Akin crossed into Ijibo territory, he was unaware of the curious and suspicious glances cast his way. Among those watching was Elder Sylvester, a respected member of King George's court. The elder's face contorted with shock and confusion at the sight of a Yoruba man walking freely through their streets. "What in the world?" Elder Sylvester whispered to himself, adjusting his red chieftaincy cap. "Has King George authorized this visit from our sworn enemy? Surely not. I was with him just yesterday, and he mentioned nothing of the sort." As Mr. Akin continued on his way, oblivious to the stir he was causing, Elder Sylvester's expression hardened. "This is an outrage," he decided. "I must inform the king of this immediately." Meanwhile, Mr. Akin approached a group of men playing chess under a mango tree. "Excuse me," he said politely. I'm looking for Mr. James's house. Could you help me?" The men exchanged glances before one of them pointed down the road. "Third house on the right, with the blue door," he said gruffly. Thanking them, Mr. Akin made his way to the indicated house. Taking a deep breath, he knocked on the wooden door. After a moment, Mr. James appeared, surprise evident on his face. "Mr. Akin," he said, clearly taken aback, "this is unexpected. Please come in." As they settled in the living room, Mr. James spoke first. "I must say, this is quite a surprise. What brings you to our community?" Mr. Akin smiled wryly. "The things we do for our family, right?" Indeed, Mr. James nodded, a hint of understanding in his eyes. Without further preamble, Mr. Akin got to the heart of the matter. "Mr. James, I'm here about Kiki. She's been in a terrible state these past days. She barely eats, can't concentrate on anything, and spends most of her time crying in her room. I'm worried about her. Please, could you talk to Mike? Ask him to forgive her, or at least hear her out." Mr. James listened intently, his expression softening. "I understand completely," he said. "To be honest, Mike hasn't been himself either. He's been distant and unhappy. But I have some good news for you." Mr. Akin leaned forward, hope flickering in his eyes. "Elder Chidi, one of the elders who attended the meeting, has spoken with Mike," Mr. James continued. "He managed to talk some sense into him. Mike has agreed to talk to Kiki and give her a chance to explain herself." A wave of relief washed over Mr. Akin's face. "Thank God," he breathed. "And thank Elder Chidi for his wisdom. Kiki will be overjoyed to hear this." Mr. James smiled warmly. "Let's see where things go from here. We can only hope for the best." As the tension eased, Mr. Akin glanced around the room. "Where's your wife, by the way? I haven't seen Mama Ada." "Oh, she's at the market selling her vegetables," Mr. James explained. "Ah, I see. That's wonderful," Mr. Akin nodded. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows through the windows, Mr. Akin realized it was time to leave. He stood, extending his hand to Mr. James. "Thank you for your hospitality and understanding. I would be very grateful if Mike could meet with Kiki as soon as possible." Mr. James nodded, shaking Mr. Akin's hand firmly. "I'll relay the message to Mike as soon as he returns home. We all want to see this resolved." "Thank you truly," Mr. Akin said once more as he turned to leave. Mike sat by the stream, his usual spot for finding peace. The gentle sound of flowing water soothed his troubled mind, but his thoughts kept drifting back to Kiki. He sighed heavily, talking to himself. "Do I really need to speak to Kiki?" he muttered. "What could she possibly tell me that would change anything? She played me for a fool, and that's that. Nothing she says can undo what she did." He pondered on the concept of forgiveness, his brow furrowed in confusion. Forgiveness is such a strong quality to have. I don't understand how people forgive so easily. I wish I could, but for Elder Chidi's sake, I'll hear what she has to say. With a deep sigh, Mike stood up, humming a traditional tune as he headed home. The familiar path felt comforting under his feet, a stark contrast to the turmoil in his heart. Suddenly, a familiar voice called out his name. "Mike! Mike!" He turned, recognizing his mother's voice immediately. Mama Ada approached, her footsteps light and quick. "Mama," Mike said, sensing her unusual excitement. "What's happened? You sound overjoyed." Mama Ada playfully patted his back, her voice brimming with happiness. "Oh, Mike, you won't believe it. I sold all my vegetables at the market today." A smile spread across Mike's face. "Is that so? Wow, that's great news, Mama." Then, with a mischievous grin, he added, "Well, thank goodness. Maybe we'll eat something better than pap in the house today. I'm tired of that stuff." They both burst into laughter, the tension of the past few days momentarily forgotten. As they walked home together, Mike felt a warmth in his heart that had been missing for a while. Upon reaching home, they found Mr. James waiting for them. As soon as they entered, he turned to Mama Ada. "You'll never guess who came to visit today," he said, a hint of excitement in his voice. Mama Ada's eyes widened with curiosity. "Who?" "Mr. Akin, mister." James replied, "Kiki's father." What Mama Ada gasped, clearly surprised. Why did he come all the way here? Mr. James proceeded to explain Mr. Akin's visit and his concerns about Kiki. He then turned to Mike, his voice gentle but firm. "Son, Mr. Akin came here hoping you'd be willing to talk to Kiki. He says she's been very upset, barely eating or leaving her room." Mike's face remained impassive, but his father could sense the internal struggle. "I told him about your conversation with Elder Chidi," Mr. James continued, "and that you've agreed to hear Kiki out." Mike nodded silently, his mind racing with conflicting emotions. "Mr. Akin was very relieved," his father added. "He hopes you can meet with Kiki soon." Without a word, Mike turned and headed to his room, leaving his parents to exchange worried glances. Once alone, Mike sat on his bed, his head in his hands. The weight of the situation pressed down on him. The path forward seemed clouded with uncertainty. As night fell, Mike lay awake, his mind filled with thoughts of Kiki, forgiveness, and what the future might hold. As Elder Sylvester hurried into King George's palace, his face flushed with urgency, he found the king seated on his ornate throne. King George, known for his wisdom and cunning nature, looked up with interest as the elder approached. "My king," Elder Sylvester began, bowing deeply, "I bring disturbing news from our community." King George leaned forward, his eyes sharp. "Speak, Elder Sylvester. What troubles you so much?" Elder Sylvester took a deep breath. "Your Majesty, I witnessed something unthinkable. A Yoruba man, our sworn enemy, entered our community without approval or announcement." King George's eyes flashed with anger, his body tensing visibly. What he thundered, his voice echoing through the chamber. "What did you just say, Elder Sylvester?" The elder, trembling slightly, repeated his words. "A Yoruba man, my king. He walked freely through our streets, as if he belonged here." King George's face contorted with rage, his breathing becoming rapid and shallow. He rose from his throne, pacing back and forth like a caged lion. "This is an outrage," he roared. Turning to one of his guards, he barked, "You, go into the community immediately. Ask questions. Find out who this Yoruba man came to see. I want to know who had the audacity to invite our enemy without my knowledge." The guard bowed hastily and rushed out, leaving the king and elder alone in the tense atmosphere of the throne room. As King George's initial fury began to subside, Elder Sylvester cautiously approached him. "My lord," he ventured, "if I may ask, what will happen when we discover who the Yoruba man came to see?" King George turned to him, his eyes dark and threatening. "They will pay," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "They will pay deeply and severely. I swear on my late wife's grave, this transgression will not go unpunished." The king's words hung heavy in the air, promising retribution. Elder Sylvester nodded solemnly, both awed and frightened by his ruler's intensity. As they waited for the guard's return, King George resumed his seat, his mind racing with possibilities. Who among his people would dare to consort with the Yoruba? And more importantly, why? These questions burned in his mind, fueling his anger and determination to get to the bottom of this mystery. The palace fell into an uneasy silence, the tension palpable as King and Elder awaited news that would undoubtedly shake the foundations of their community. The consequences of this unexpected visitor were yet to unfold, but one thing was certain: King George would not rest until he uncovered the truth and exacted his punishment. As Mr. Akin returned home, the aroma of a hearty meal greeted him. He found Mama Kiki in the kitchen, busily preparing dinner. "Welcome home," she said warmly. "I knew you'd be hungry after your long journey." Mr. Akin smiled gratefully, then asked, "Where's Kiki?" Mama Kiki sighed, in her room, as usual. "But what happened? I can hear excitement in your voice. Tell me everything." Mr. Akin's face lit up. "Well, Mike has agreed to see Kiki." "Oh, thank goodness," Mama Kiki exclaimed, her eyes sparkling with hope. "Kiki will finally have a reason to smile. You should go tell her right away." Nodding, Mr. Akin made his way to Kiki's room. He found her sitting on her bed, looking forlorn and lost in thought. As he entered with a broad smile, Kiki looked up, her eyes questioning. "Dad, what is it? How did your journey go?" she asked hastily, a mix of hope and fear in her voice. Mr. Akin sat beside her, placing a gentle hand on her shoulder. "Well, my lovely daughter, I have good news for you." Kiki leaned forward, her heart racing. "What is it, Papa?" "Mike has agreed to meet with you," Mr. Akin announced, his voice filled with joy. "He's willing to listen to what you have to say." Kiki's eyes widened in disbelief. She jumped up, her face breaking into the first genuine smile in days. "Really, Papa? Oh, thank you. Thank you so much." Mr. Akin nodded, basking in his daughter's happiness. "Yes, my love. My journey to the Agbo community was a fruitful one." "I can see that," Kiki said, still beaming. She hugged her father tightly, then pulled back. "I want to go help Mama in the kitchen now. I feel like I can do anything." As Kiki bounded out of the room, her steps light for the first time in days, Mr. Akin felt a surge of pride. He had faced his fears, traveled to a potentially hostile community, and succeeded in bringing joy back to his daughter's life. It was a father's triumph, and he savored the moment. However, unbeknownst to Mr. Akin and his family, trouble was brewing in the Agbo community. Over trespassing and the troubles and problems were coming to hunt him and his family. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the palace grounds, King George's guard returned, his face flushed from his hurried search through the community. He entered the throne room and immediately dropped to one knee, bowing his head in respect. "Rise," King George commanded, his voice taut with impatience. "What news do you bring?" The guard stood, his eyes fixed on the ground as he spoke. "My lord, I questioned many in our community, but most were unaware of any Yoruba visitor." King George's frown deepened, his fingers drumming against the arm of his throne. "And yet you stand before me. You must have found something." The guard nodded quickly. "Yes, Your Majesty. I came upon a group of men playing chess under a large tree. They informed me that the Yoruba man had come to see Mr. James." "Mr. James?" King George's voice rose in anger. "Who is this Mr. James that dares to disregard my authority and disobey my orders?" The guard hesitated, then added, They referred to him as the drunk, Your Majesty." "A drunk?" King George bellowed, his face turning red with fury. He stood up abruptly, causing the guard to take a step back. "Describe this man to me." The guard quickly provided a description of Mr. James, but it was clear from the king's expression that the name meant nothing to him. King George paced back and forth, his robe swishing angrily with each step. Finally, he turned to the guard, his eyes blazing. "Go, fetch this Mr. James from his home and bring him to me immediately. I want to look into the eyes of the man who would invite our enemy into our midst." "At once, Your Majesty," the guard replied. bowing deeply before turning on his heel and rushing out of the palace. As the guard's footsteps faded, King George turned to Elder Sylvester, who had been watching the exchange in tense silence. "Can you believe this?" Elder King George fumed. "A drunkard consorting with our enemies. What has become of our proud community?" Elder Sylvester shook his head solemnly. "It is indeed troubling, Your Majesty. But perhaps there is more to this story than we know." King George scoffed. "What more could there be? This Mr. James has committed treason, pure and simple. He will face the consequences of his actions." As they waited for the guard's return with Mr. James, tension hung heavy in the air. The fate of Mr. James and potentially the delicate balance between the Igbo and Yoruba communities hung in the balance, all hinging on the whims of an angry king and the explanations of a man unaware of the storm about to break over his head. The evening breeze blew gently across the Igbo village, carrying with it the aroma of Mama Ada's cooking. She stood outside their modest hut, stirring a pot of soup while Mike lay nearby, enjoying the cool air. Suddenly, the peaceful atmosphere was shattered by the sound of approaching footsteps and raised voices. Mama Ada looked up, her eyes widening as she saw a group of palace guards marching towards their home. "Hey, you there," one of the guards shouted, his voice rough with urgency. "Where is Mr. James?" Mike quickly rose to his feet, moving protectively in front of his mother. "What's going on?" he demanded, his voice steady despite his rising fear. "What has my father done?" Another guard stepped forward, his face stern. "The king has summoned him to the palace immediately. We must take him now." Just then, Mr. James emerged from the hut, his face a mixture of confusion and concern. "What is this about?" he asked, looking from the guards to his worried family. "What have I done?" Without waiting for an explanation, two guards seized Mr. James by the arms and hoisted him onto their shoulders. Mama Ada gasped in shock, her hand flying to her mouth. "Stop!" she cried out. "Where are you taking him?" Mike made a move to follow, but one of the guards held out a hand to stop him. "Do not follow us to the palace," the guard warned, his voice low and threatening. "It will only make things worse for your father if you do." As the guards carried Mr. James away, Mama Ada and Mike stood frozen, their minds reeling from the sudden turn of events. Mama, Mike whispered, his voice trembling slightly. "What's happening? Why would the king want to see Papa?" Mama Ada shook her head, her eyes never leaving the retreating figures of the guards and her husband. "I don't know, my son. I truly don't know." They watched helplessly as Mr. James was taken further and further away, his confused protests fading into the distance. The village around them had gone quiet, neighbors peeking out from behind curtains and doorways, whispering among themselves. "Should we follow them?" Mama Mike asked, his fists clenched at his sides. "We can't just let them take Papa like this." Mama Ada placed a comforting hand on her son's shoulder, though her own voice shook with worry. "No, Mike, we must do as they say. Following them might only make things worse for your father." As the guards and Mr. James disappeared from view, Mama Ada and Mike slowly went back into their hut, the festive mood of earlier completely evaporating. The pot of soup bubbled forgotten on the fire outside, a stark reminder of how quickly their peaceful evening had turned into a nightmare. Inside, Mama Ada paced back and forth, her mind racing. "What could your father have done to anger the king?" she muttered, more to herself than to Mike. "He's always been a law-abiding citizen, never causing trouble." Mike sat on a low stool, his unseeing eyes fixed on the floor. "Do you think he started, then hesitated? Do you think it has something to do with Mr. Akin's visit earlier?" Mama Ada stopped pacing, a chill running down her spine. "Oh no," she whispered, "surely not. But if it is," she kept silent, imagining the repercussions of their action. The implications hung heavy in the air. If Mr. James was in trouble for hosting a Yoruba visitor, what did that mean for Mike's relationship with Kiki? What did it mean for the fragile peace between their communities? As night fell over the village, Mama Ada and Mike sat in tense silence, waiting and praying for Mr. James's safe return. Outside, the village buzzed with gossip and speculation, unaware of the potential storm brewing that could change everything. As the palace doors swung open, King George ceased his restless pacing, his eyes sharp with anger, fixed upon Mr. James as the guards dragged him in. "So you are Mr. James?" King George's voice was low, dangerously calm. Suddenly, his composure shattered. "How dare you?" he roared, his face contorted with rage. "How dare you bring a Yoruba man into our community?" Mr. James, realizing the gravity of the situation, opened his mouth to explain, but King George silenced him with a wave of his hand. "Silence," the king thundered. "I will ask the questions here. What is the name of the man who came to our community?" Trembling, Mr. James replied, "Mr. Akin, my lord." A sinister smile played across King George's lips. "Mr. Akin? Very good," he turned to the guards. "Take him away. And on your way out, summon my second in command immediately." As Mr. James was led away, his protests falling on deaf ears, the king's second in command entered the chamber. He bowed low, awaiting instructions. "I need you to write a letter," King George said, his voice now eerily calm. "Address it to King Oba of the Yoruba people." The second in command nodded, quickly retrieving parchment and quill. As King George dictated, he wrote, "To King Oba of the Yoruba. It has come to my attention that one of your subjects, a man named Mr. Akin, has trespassed into our lands without permission. This is a grave violation of the long-standing agreement between our peoples. I demand an explanation for this breach of trust and protocol. Furthermore, I expect you to punish this Mr. Akin for his transgression. Should you fail to do so, I will be forced to take matters into my own hands. Consider this a formal warning. The peace between our kingdoms hangs in the balance. Signed, King George of the Igbo." As the second in command finished writing, King George nodded in approval. He then walked to a large, ornate perch near the window. With a sharp whistle, a massive black raven swooped down, landing on the king's outstretched arm. The bird's feathers gleamed in the torchlight, its intelligent eyes fixed on King George. The king carefully attached the letter to the raven's leg. "Deliver this to King Oba," he commanded. The raven cawed once in acknowledgement before taking flight, disappearing into the night sky. King George watched it go, a mixture of satisfaction and anticipation on his face. "Now we wait," he murmured. Meanwhile, in the dungeons below, Mr. James sat in a damp cell, his head in his hands. He couldn't help but think of his family, of Mike and Mama Ada, wondering if they knew what had happened to him. "What have I done?" he whispered to himself. "I only wanted to help my son find happiness. How did it come to this?" As the night wore on, tension gripped both kingdoms. In the Igbo palace, King George waited impatiently for a response, his anger simmering. In the Yoruba kingdom, blissfully unaware of the approaching storm, Mr. Akin and his family celebrated what they thought was a step towards reconciliation. And somewhere between these two worlds, a black raven flew, carrying a message that would shatter the fragile peace and set in motion events that would test the bonds of family, love, and loyalty. The stage was set for a confrontation that would shake both kingdoms to their core. As dawn approached, neither King George nor King Oba could have foreseen the challenges that lay ahead, or the unlikely allies that would emerge in the face of adversity. In the heart of the Yoruba kingdom, King Oba sat upon his intricately carved wooden throne, a sinister smile playing across his face. The tribal marks etched deep into his skin seemed to dance in the flickering torchlight, adding to his menacing aura. The courtyard was eerily quiet, with only the occasional nervous shuffle from his guards and cabinet members breaking the silence. Suddenly, a large black raven swooped into the courtyard, its wings casting fleeting shadows as it approached. King Oba's eyes narrowed in surprise as he watched the bird waddle towards him, a small scroll attached to its leg. "What's this?" King Oba muttered, his curiosity piqued. With a graceful leap, the raven landed on the arm of his throne. King Oba carefully removed the letter, and as soon as it was free, the bird took flight, disappearing as quickly as it had arrived. Unrolling the scroll, King Oba's eyes darted across the parchment. As he read, his expression morphed from curiosity to disbelief, and finally to unbridled rage. What he roared, his eyes blazing with fury. The sudden outburst caused his guards to flinch and his cabinet members to cower in fear. They knew all too well the deadly consequences of King Oba's anger. One brave or perhaps foolish cabinet member ventured to speak. "What is it, Your Highness?" he asked, his voice trembling. King Oba didn't respond immediately. He was too consumed by his rage, his chest heaving as he breathed heavily, trying to contain his fury. The silence stretched on, thick with tension. Finally, King Oba spoke, his voice low and dangerous. "How dare he? How dare he?" he repeated, each word dripping with venom. The cabinet members exchanged confused glances, their fear mingling with curiosity. After what seemed like an eternity, King Oba thrust the letter at one of his advisors. The advisor took the scroll with shaking hands and began to read aloud. As the words of King George's accusation filled the air, shock and disbelief spread across the faces of all present. Mr. Akin, one of the members, gasped. Why would he do something like this? Doesn't he know the consequences of such an action? King Oba's eyes narrowed dangerously. He had been quiet, lost in thought, but now he raised a finger, pointing it accusingly as if Mr. Akin stood before him. "Go," he commanded, his voice filled with cold fury. "Go to Mr. Akin's house and fetch him immediately. Bring him to me and make sure his family comes too. I want to look into the eyes of the man who dares to betray our people." The guards hesitated for a moment, stunned by the intensity of the king's anger. King Oba noticed their hesitation and roared, "Now!" Jolted into action. A group of guards hurried out of the courtyard, their armor clanking as they rushed to obey their king's command. As the sound of their departure faded, King Oba turned to his remaining advisors. "Prepare for war," he growled. "If King George wants to threaten us, we'll show him what the Yoruba are capable of." The advisors nodded nervously, scurrying to carry out the king's orders. As they left, King Oba remained on his throne, his fingers drumming an ominous rhythm on the armrest. "Mr. Akin," he muttered to himself, "you have no idea what you've done. Your little visit may have just started a war."
Write the word "continue" in the comment section if you want the next part, and please subscribe to our YouTube channel.
Thank you for watching this video. I hope you enjoyed watching. Kindly click the subscribe button, like, comment, and share this video. Watch out for more intriguing and eye-catching videos from your favorite YouTube channel.